This is a patient who had right ventricular myocarditis, a very rare cause. It was an immunological disease. And what happened here was that the right ventricle was even electrophysiologically completely dead. And there was practically only very little contraction left. You see that the right ventricle is not moving at all, and that even the tricuspid valve is not closing, not only because there's annual dilatation, but because there is no pressure in the right ventricle to close the tricuspid valve. And this can also be seen here in this example where there is tricuspid regurgitation with almost no turbulent flow, simply because the pressure in the right ventricle was not high. Here again is the same patient in an earlier stage. That was when he had, the acute onset of this myocarditis, and you see that there is no contraction here. The tricuspid valve is just moving back and forth more with relationship to respiration than really to the contraction of the right ventricle. And here you see that despite the fact that the valve is open, we don't really see any turbulent flow. This is something that you will not see very frequently, but it brings me to a topic which I also believe is very important, and that is looking at the flow signal across the pulmonary artery. Now, in a normal individual, you will have a relatively round spectrum of the pulmonary artery or RVOT flow signal. And what you can see is that the velocity is somewhere in the range of 1.2 meters per second, and that the area under this curve is quite high. Now, in a patient who has poor right ventricular function, the area under the curve will be very little, very small. What we usually do is we contour this curve and then calculate what we call the velocity time integral. In our patient with poor right ventricular function, velocity time integral is 13.6 centimeters, which is not very high. Some patients we see it going down to even 7 or 8. Now, in this patient here, velocity time integral will be probably above 22, 25. So this basically reflects poor right ventricular output and is therefore also a measure of right ventricular function. But now let's go back to the patient I showed you previously with the dead right ventricle. Now here, we're not even able to measure a signal across the pulmonary artery. What we see is we see fluctuations of flow which follow basically the pattern of respiration. In other words, the suction of the right ventricle is the one who causes a little bit of flow, at least, into the pulmonary artery. And what we have is we have antegrade diastolic flow, so flow at a time when it actually should not occur. This is another sign of a very poor right ventricle.